so this is negative externalities, and this is quite a hard section. This is specification objectives, and we're just going to look at negative externalities for this video. So externalities are where a third party are affected by the actions of production or consumption, and negative externalities are usually where this third party is affected in a negative way, which is why the name is called negative externalities, but where there's a cost really to a third party. And in case you didn't know, a third party are those not directly involved in making a decision about the production or the consumption. So they're not the buyer, they're not the seller, they're not the consumer, they're not the producer, but they're someone who is affected by the actions, this economic activity. So key definitions here, because we're looking at negative externalities, we're often looking at the kind of costs of an activity. So private costs are the costs incurred by those taking a particular action. So if we're thinking about the buyer, we're thinking about price to them. If we're thinking about the seller, we're thinking about the costs of production to them. Whereas external costs are the costs that are the consequences of externalities to third parties. So these are things that occur because of the action taking place, but they're not to the buyer or the seller. They're somebody who is not involved in the decision making. And social costs is just adding up the private cost and the external cost. This is sometimes called the full cost or the true cost sometimes. So this is my little diagram. It's a bit of a lame diagram really, but it's just showing you that social costs are both the private costs and the external costs added together. Cost should have an S on the end there, but I think one's missing. Okay, so a negative externality exists where there's an external cost to a third party. Now, this is the really important thing. I'm just going to underline this because it's so important. And students get really kind of bogged down about, is it in production? Is it in consumption? And yeah, it's good to be accurate. It's good to be specific. It's good to know whether it's a negative externality in production or consumption. However, you need to just be clear that the negative externality exists in the first place because of an external cost to a third party. So this is the most important element. And therefore, you've probably guessed as well that a positive externality is going to exist where there's an external benefit. So negative externality is external cost, positive externality, external benefits. Okay, so these diagrams are sometimes hard, but let's work through them and hopefully this will make it a bit easier. I have drawn out these diagrams in another presentation as well, and I draw them out a little bit more slowly as well, so you might want to check out that presentation. So in all of my diagrams, I'm going to do the actual equilibrium as P1, Q1, and let's just imagine this is a 1, that's a 1 there, this is a D1, this is S1, there we go. And the socially optimal equilibrium is going to be P2, Q2. So this is, we're looking at production, and the key is whenever you're looking at a negative externality in production, it's actually supply that's going to be moving. We're going to have two supplies. So here we go. The producer took into account the full cost of their activity, including, oops, that shouldn't be down. Let's plug that in. If they took into account the full cost, including the external costs, their costs would be much higher than they currently are. And we know when costs increase, supply moves to the left, it moves inwards there. So the socially optimal equilibrium being the one where we take into account the full cost of an activity would be there, Q2 and P1, sorry, P2, bit of a slip up there. There we go. So that's your diagram. That's what it'll look like. You can label it the other way around. I've seen students label it S1 and S2, but what's really important is that when they come to that explanation, it's really consistent. So on my diagram, the actual equilibrium that we're at is this point here, whereas the socially optimal is going to be this point. So we're here, we're actually here, but we wish we were here, if we're taking all the costs into account. So what happens is producers don't take into account the full costs of their activities, and this means that the price actually ends up being lower than it should be. And we know when price is lower than it be, or price is, you know, lower than the full cost would reflect, we actually have this incentive for consumers to purchase. So rather than the quantity demanded being here, it's actually here. It's kind of this extension of demand here. So we find that the quantity is higher than it should be really. And this means that there's a misallocation of resources. It's allocatively inefficient. You can call it allocatively inefficient. Too many scarce resources are being diverted to this production here. So we should be producing this amount, and instead we're producing this amount. So all of our solutions to this problem should be focusing on reducing the amount produced. Now, some students like to shade in the actual kind of monetary value of the overproduction, and what you do is, the rule is, go from actual equilibrium, so this is actual equilibrium, look for the other curve. It's actually above in this case. It's going to be below on the next diagram I draw, but it's above in this case. So draw your line up, and that space there represents the external cost, that vertical distance there. But if you want to shade in box, it's hard for me on a computer, but you can do it better than me at home, with pencil and pens. That represents, sometimes we call that the welfare loss or the deadweight loss, but really that triangle just represents the monetary value of the externality, the external cost that's being caused there. Okay, so that's negative externalities in production. Let's have a look at a few examples. So we've got pollution. We can see here very much looking like production and kind of byproducts of production, some pollution and CO2 emissions and other emissions in the air that make asthma more kind of common. What's really important when we're looking at negative externalities and you're looking at external costs, lots of students are very good at identifying the external cost, the externality, but what they're not so great at identifying is the third party. So it's a cost to people's health and well-being, maybe it's a cost to the NHS, an increased healthcare treatment. It doesn't look so nice maybe living here, noise pollution I'm thinking of, so maybe it's the third party, the people that own these houses. I've heard actually that divorce rates are much higher near airports, so we don't know if that's cause and effect. We don't know if it causes marriages to break down, or that people that have more kind of on the rocks marriages just find that they want to live in areas near airports. We don't know if it's causal or just a kind of link between the two. But yeah, what we'd find in terms of an external cost would be that house prices would be lower than they would normally be, because people don't tend to like to live under flight paths. It's a bit scary, isn't it? That plane being so close. And congestion could be another negative externality in production. So if there's a very busy city like London, we find there's lots of congestion because there's lots of business going on, lots of production going on there, but we get an external cost in terms of time wasting and people's journeys being slowed down. So we've got external costs to other businesses, we've got external costs to maybe the tourism industry, and we've also got CO2 emissions as well, and asthma and all those types of problems, and costs to the NHS, and accidents as well. So not so many nice things. Okay. This is a negative externality in consumption now. So we're thinking consumption, and the first thing that should pop into your head is consumption is all to do with demand. So I'm just going to label these up first of all because they didn't come labelled. So S1, D1 being our actual equilibrium, sorry for the delay, actual equilibrium, whereas P2, Q2 and D2 are going to be our socially optimal equilibrium. So negative externalities in consumption is where the consumer doesn't take into account the full cost of their activities, and if they were taking into account the full cost of their activities, demand would be much more to the left. There'd be a lower amount of demand. Okay, so we're going to get the kind of same picture, that Q2 is to the left of Q1. So we can see overproduction here, too much production. But in this case, we're going to see that the price is that. So we're going to see that the price is actually, sorry, I've just previewed some of that. The price is actually going to be higher than it should be. So here's the rundown of what's happening. So consumers don't take into account the full cost of their activities. This means that the price is higher than it should be, and we know that the price being higher, because we're going to see a movement along the supply curve. So I'll just change the colour of my pen so we can see more clearly. The equilibrium should be here, but it's actually here, and so we can see that when the price is higher, there's an incentive for consumers to increase their production. So we see this extension again of the supply there. So, you know, they're happy because, you know, they're getting maybe a higher price than they would otherwise have been in the market if consumers were really taking into the full account of the costs of their activities. So producers are thinking, yeah, this is a great deal for us, and the people that are consuming are thinking, yeah, this is fine because I can't actually feel the pain that I'm causing other people, the third parties with my activities. So the equilibrium quantity is going to be higher than it should be. We've said that before, and so there's a misallocation of resources. It's allocatively inefficient. Too many scarce resources are being allocated to production. And if we want to show what this looks like, the rule is you go to the actual equilibrium, which is here, and then you look for the other curve, which in this case is going to be below. And this, again, is going to represent the external cost. And then it's just that shading in that little triangle there. This is called the deadweight loss or the welfare loss. And this is this shaded in part is representing the monetary value that the monetary value of the external cost, sorry. So that's being lost. It's inefficient. So let's have a look at some examples of negative externalities in consumption. So smoking causes external costs to third parties. Somebody sat next to you, their clothes are not going to smell very nice. But even worse than that, passive smoke and the damaging effect to your health. And then you think about the damaging effect to the third party of the NHS having to pay for this care and attention for someone that maybe has never smoked in their life. They've just sat next to someone that's smoking. This is a sign that I found on the internet. I think someone's put this up in their office, but I was thinking of like stinky smells and somebody else maybe cooking something that's a little bit stinky and it gets into your clothes. So there's just a kind of general unpleasant feeling. If we could put a value, a price on an unpleasant feeling of having to work in an office with someone eating stinky food, that would be the external cost to that third party. The person has not decided to eat stinky fish. And growing problem in this country and most developed countries around the world is obesity and the effect on people's health, but that would be actually a private cost, but it's the cost to the NHS as well of increased healthcare costs and such. So externalities costs, when there's a divergence between the private and social costs and benefits. Yep, we're looking at negative externalities, so there's a difference between the private and social costs because there's an external costs. We've seen that through these diagrams it results in overproduction and overconsumption, and we've looked at using demand and supply diagrams to show these negative externalities in production and consumption. And you might have seen some notes on this from last year, and I've put some of this labelling into my other video, but that's for students that are doing the resit really, because you don't need to use that marginal social cost, marginal social benefit labelling anymore.